Hey guys, I'm Sebastian and welcome to Atmoseeker. Today I'm going to look at kind of revitalizing an old project. We had a past adventure where the party was exploring these very desolate and swampy bogs with these very not good witches that were made of worms. They were a whole thing. Anyway, there was this encounter where they fought the hags. I had this little swamp board, and to make do, I made these little swampy kind of trees, and they were kind of made from this like florist's wire, and they got the job done, but I think there's room for improvement, and that's what we're going to look at today. I'm going to use these, maybe some more of this florist wire, a lot more hot glue, and see if we can make these a little better. So let's hit the table. Okay, so I'm just making these bases out of foam core and just using a very sharp blade to cut at an angle, just gonna have this beveled edge to it. Just cutting about 5 in different sizes. Here I'm just breaking up some polystyrene with my hands, just, you know, your basic packing foam, just to build up the basic structure of the terrain. Securing it all with hot glue. Pulling out the hot wire tool here, just cutting out some basic styrofoam shapes for these giant root-like structures that I'm going to have. The packing foam I'm using here is a lot denser, so it'll come up a lot smoother when cutting it with the hot wire. Sculpting it this way makes some really nice overarching hollows. So I'm recycling some of these wire tree structures that I made earlier. They're just made from this florist wire that has this paper-like structure over the surface. I used them at the time because it was a good, quick way of having a bark feel to these trees. But I figure if I'm coating these in a hot glue for the bark texture, if I miss any points, it'll still have this barky texture to it. To secure them, I'm just poking them into the foam and using some hot glue. Something I missed in the recording is I also used a finer wire that I just got from the hardware store, and I twisted them around a larger wire structure to create these thinner branches. Using hot glue here to build up the texture on the foam. This is what's going to make the bark and winding roots that give it that swampy character. I'm just running the glue down to make those main bark lines and root lines. On some of the more pronounced and lower roots, I'll let some of the glue cool and then layer over again, just to build up those roots a bit more. Then just taking the glue gun's nozzle and running it over the hot glue to create that texture. It's a bit time consuming, but the result has a very nice kind of bark-like feel to it. Taking some Sculptamold here, gonna use it around the base and some of those foam structures we made earlier to build up a muddy, earthy texture around these trees. Mixing it with water to the consistency of runny oats. Started applying it with a popsicle stick, but it just paid off to get your hands dirty and just do it with your hands. It was a lot easier. It dries reasonably quickly, so after it dries for about 10 minutes, I just wet my finger with water and just run it over some of these areas to smooth them out. Just fixing some of those exposed roots that got hidden by the Sculptamold. I'm building them on top of this silicone hot glue mat, which means I can bleed the roots over the edge to help blend it onto the table when placing the terrain. There you go, peels off nice and easy. Now just thickening up some of those lower roots and blending it with the hot nozzle of the glue gun. Just a side effect of working with so much hot glue is it creates a lot of these wispy strands. I'm just using the heat gun here to eliminate some of those cobwebs. Good to be careful so we don't melt away some of that detail we worked on. I hadn't worked with Sculptamold before, but I was a bit worried that the surface wouldn't be as strong. So I mixed some Mod Podge with black acrylic, which I guess isn't necessary since I'm spray painting the whole thing black anyway. The idea was to strengthen any of the Sculptamold surface that I have there and go over the exposed foam, because that has a tendency to melt when using spray primers. I'm adding some loose shale here as some rock scatter, which in hindsight probably would have been better to press into the Sculptamold when it was still wet. I used this ultra matte spray primer just because of the plasticky nature of the hot glue. I didn't feel like it was matte enough. I went over it with a very matte black acrylic craft paint. Finally time to add some color to these swampy boys. Starting off with my old favorite burnt umber as a base color for the tree. This came up very dark, especially after priming it black. It's hard to tell because it comes up a bit lighter when it's wet. So I went up a notch up to burnt sienna to help lighten it up a bit. Once that was done, it was time to accentuate that bark texture with some tan. Really have a very low amount of paint on the brush, just to dry brush it on there and hit those high edges. Now just focusing on the ground texture by dry brushing on some Amish grey. You can see a lot of that detail starting to pop through. Now just adding some colour, just using some leaf green to help simulate the rising tide of the swamp, just around the lower roots and branches. It'll give the impression that there's moss or algae. I'm taking the brush strokes from the bottom of the piece upwards, so it gives it a gradient effect. Now just building over the top of that with a grass green, a lighter green to help make that algae moss section of the tree really pop a bit more. I felt like the base was blending a bit too much with the tree, so to help differentiate that, I used one of these Citadel washes. This is an Athonian camo shade, so this is kind of a greener wash. Putting that over the earthy section of the trees helped contrast that a bit more. It's subtle, but it helps. Experimenting a bit here by using some Mod Podge mixed with this green flock I've made. The flock is just sawdust mixed with acrylic, just using it to make this moss that will stick to the surface of the tree and give it some nice texture. The idea is to just use it sparingly, but to add little key features of colour to the piece. I'm a little nervous about the colour of the flock, but I guess we'll find out. Adding a little bit of shrubbery to the terrain with this artificial moss. Just gluing it on there with a good dab of hot glue and pressing it there for a moment. I felt like the moss was sticking out a bit too much color-wise, so I took some of this yellow ochre acrylic and just kind of brushed it over the top, even just little sections around the moss to help blend it in with the terrain. Time to take these boys outside and give them a nice spray of matte varnish. This will help seal in the paint job and some of that flock and moss that we put on. After that's all dry, just going to add some little water feature-ish kind of puddles to these pieces. I'm using the gloss version of Mod Podge and brushing thickly in areas where I think water would settle. It'll dry nice and clear and hard. Adding a little bit of leaf debris to the pieces now, just with this green tea flock, which is just emptied green tea bags into this cup, and just securing it with some matte Mod Podge by brushing that onto the surface and just sprinkling it on. The glossy Mod Podge puddle water effects that I had done were coming across just a little bit too clear, so I used some of the same Athonian camo shade wash from Citadel to try and murky them up a bit. I think I'm going to call these pieces done. Stay tuned to the end of the show to see some of this terrain in some fog and lighting effects. Wow, these turned out great. Really impressed how all the textures and different techniques have come together. Especially with the moss, I was second guessing myself. And it looks like it's a good amount of pieces to really kind of throw on the table and have a good immersive encounter. And these don't just have to be a swamp, it could be a twisted forest, especially if you throw other kinds of scatter in there. Combined with the lighting, a little bit of fog, it really kind of picks up. This was a lot of fun to do. And if you did like the video and like what I'm doing here on the channel, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And hit the bell icon if you want to see notifications when new videos pop up on the channel. I'm Sebastian, this is Atmoseeker, and let's create and inspire. I'll see you on the next Atmoseeker. See you later.